Nvidia recently released an RTX ON, which is what my head's covering up here, trailer for The Lord of the Rings Gollum. The upcoming game should be out on May 25th. And this is cross-platform and cross-gen on consoles. I think there's even a Nintendo Switch port coming. A lot of the assets, if you look at these, like if we jump back a second, like that doesn't look super high detailed. I'll have this linked in the video description if you want to check it out closer yourself. Although I hope you don't have an ultra-wide monitor trying to watch the ultra-wide 21:9 footage, because it's one of the ones that's encoded at 16:9, so even if you full screen it on a 21:9, anyway, that's a whole other thing. If we get a widescreen trailer, can we just encode it and upload it in widescreen, please? Anyway, the point is, if you actually look at the details, a lot of it, if you freeze it, the assets don't look that crazy, and again, it does support last-gen consoles, which is why I was a little bit surprised when I saw this headline. Lord of the Rings Gollum, absurd PC requirements demand DLSS for anything above 1080p. And I was like, wait, what? What? Isn't it getting a Switch port? So I looked into this, and it looks like Nvidia did a post, buried in a bigger post about some other driver update stuff, talking about Lord of the Rings Gollum, where this trailer dropped, as well as a big system requirements chart. Now this has a lot going on with it. It has ray tracing off system requirements as well as ray tracing on system requirements. It separates it out by various resolutions. There's a lot of really good stuff here. But then you dig into some of the details, and I'm a little more confused. So number one, if we just hop right in here at what do you need to just play the game? If you want to play this game, apparently at 1080p 30 frames per second low, you need a GTX 1060 or 2060. Now already this is a little bit weird. For one thing, an RTX 2060 getting 1080p 30 frames per second low, and remember we're not on the ray tracing side of the chart here, we're at the non-ray trace side of the chart here. That seems a little bit brutal for the types of visuals that we were seeing on display here. Again, none of this seems mind-blowing, and this is with RTX on in these screenshots. I'm just looking at the underlying asset resolution, that kind of thing. I don't know. I know a 2060 is not as new and powerful as it used to be, but not that it was ever like super powerful, but you get the idea. 1080p 30 FPS low. Also GTX 1060 listed next to that is a bit weird. So if we hop over to the Tech Power Up relative performance chart, if you watched me do similar videos to this in the past, I find compared to a lot of the other relative performance charts on the internet, this one is more complete. You can find almost every GPU you could think of on here, but it's also fairly accurate. I don't think this data gets updated on the latest drivers and all of that for the latest games, and every game can behave a bit differently, but it gives you a good ballpark figure at least to go off of. So the GTX 1060 6GB, which is what I'm assuming they're talking about here, there was a 3GB version that was a little bit weaker, had a lot less VRAM. If we go ahead and scroll down, you can see other GPUs that are in this ballpark. So first of all, if you have something like a 970, that has less VRAM, so as long as the VRAM is not the limit, you should get similar performance. Although the 1060 is a bit faster, you got the RX 480. Do note that this chart is published by Nvidia, so they're not listing any AMD equivalents. So we can note that the cards like the RX 480 would be similar performance to what they're listing here, like the GTX 1060, RX 580 is in this ballpark, the 6500 XT, GTX 980, 1650 Super. So take a look at all the cards in between here. 1660 is pretty popular, 1660 Super's in here, GTX 1070, RTX 3050, 1070 Ti, 1080, and now we're getting all the way up to a 2060. In other words, the 2060 is usually more similar in performance to a 1080 than it is to a 1060, and for some reason they're listing both of these as the minimum 1080p 30 FPS low GPUs. Now one thought here is these both have 6GB of VRAM. So is this somehow VRAM related? But as the limit here, it's listing RAM here as 6, but I would assume that is system RAM, not video RAM. Because, I mean, it doesn't always match up with the cards they're listing. Like later on they list like an RTX 4070 at 10GB of RAM. So unless this chart is really badly designed, and by RAM they mean VRAM, anyway, that just seems weird. Also, again, the performance difference here is almost 60% between the 1060 and the 2060. So with a 60% performance uplift, if this is at all a reasonable recommendation, here's what they actually mean. If the GTX 1060 is getting you 30 frames per second, and we multiply by 1.6, which would be a 60% performance uplift, that takes us to 48 frames per second. So in other words, even if this is somehow a reasonable chart here, what this 30 means is it means it doesn't get you 60 consistently. Which means that the 1060 is probably closer to the actual 30 line, and the 2060 is getting you, like I said, closer to 48. You're kind of in between 30 and 60, but you're not at 60 yet. And then they're recommending you go up to a RTX 3060. They're not specifying whether it's the 8GB or 12GB version, because there's two. For 1080p, sorry, no RT, for medium settings at 60 frames per second, 1080p. Okay, so that's at least to get in the door at 1080p, low or medium. And again, I think that jump to the 3060 then does make sense, because going from the 2060 as our baseline up to the 3060 now, we're getting that extra, 20% performance, kind of taking you from that I'm a bit below 60 kind of experience to I'm at 60. So I guess that could kind of make sense anyway, but I also just don't have a high opinion of a lot of this, because if you look at the CPUs, I don't think a 4660 from Intel even exists. I could be wrong about that, but I tried Googling it, okay? So I Googled Intel i5 4660 to see what information I could find out about this processor that I could not remember existing. And all Google's returning results for is the 4460. So it's possible that's what they meant, but I'm not sure it's what they meant, because it's definitely not what they wrote down. Do any of you remember a 4660 existing? I can't find it on Google. I don't remember it. Anyway, now they do list the Ryzen 3 1200. Now they will list AMD CPUs. It's just since this was given to us by Nvidia, they're not giving us any AMD GPUs. But the Ryzen CPUs are giving us a Ryzen 3 1200. And if we take a look at that, that is a 4-core, 4-thread CPU. From 2017. So, this is one of the lower end 2017 chips. So, 6 years old, 4-core, 4-thread. So I don't think they're asking anything too crazy on that, other than the fact that they're only telling us that that would get us 30 frames per second experience. If you want to jump up to a 60 frames per second experience, and again, the resolution shouldn't really affect the frame rate on the CPU, although some graphics settings can. They're jumping up to the Ryzen 5 1600 and the Intel 4770, which does actually exist. So jumping up from the AMD CPUs, again, we're going from the Ryzen 3 1200 4-core 4-thread to the same generation of CPUs, but the Ryzen 5 1600, which is 6-core 12-thread. So perhaps this will be a little bit more stable with the extra processing power on those cores. And then the i7 4770 is the Intel equivalent, which is listed as a 4-core 8-thread CPU from 2013. So a bit older there, although higher end from an older generation, if that makes any sense. So let's jump back in here. What else is going on? Again, the RAM amount listed is very low. It's only listing 6 gigabytes of RAM and only going up to 16 gigabytes of RAM at the absolute maximum ray tracing on settings, again, unless they mean VRAM and are saying RAM, which would be very weird. But again, I don't think a 4660 exists. So let's continue to overanalyze a chart that's probably just poorly constructed in the first place. Anyway, so if we continue going on here, we can take a look at 1440p. So 1440p, high settings, 60 frames per second. They're recommending a 3060 Ti, but they're recommending it at DLSS quality. So again, this is a chart made by Nvidia. It would be nice to see what a GPU could do, to deliver that at native resolution, but it is what it is. We'll go off of what it's giving us. So we were at the RTX 2060 and then 3060. We'll set 3060 as the baseline. So this was our 1080p, 60 frames per second, medium settings. If we want to jump up to 1440p, except not really 1440p, upscaled 1440p, high settings, 60 frames per second. We got to jump up to a 3060 Ti. So you can find some GPUs in between here, like the RK 750, the 1080 Ti, 2070 Super, A770, 6600 XT, 6650 XT, 6700 XT. So the 6700 XT is pretty similar in performance to the 3060 Ti. It's a 25% boost up from the 3060. I would say that that's not enough to make sense for 1440p native, but they're not claiming native. They're claiming it for upscaled, right? DLSS quality. No, not the DLSS quality isn't a perfectly usable way to play most games at 1440p, but there it is. So the 6700 XT would be similar performance, and I haven't seen word yet on if this will be a game that does feature FSR. Again, I'm sure it will feature DLSS, including frame generation for the 40 series GPUs, but there we are. Anyway, so these would be the similar ballpark cards here. So again, maybe FSR quality on the 6700 XT, or maybe you need a more powerful GPU. Something like, usually DLSS is giving you maybe a 20-ish, anywhere from 15 to 30-ish% boost at quality settings, depending on how the game scales with resolution. So you might want these GPUs kind of here a bit more powerful if you wanted that native 1440p experience. This would probably be more like what I would assume you were looking at. And then they're jumping up to a RTX 3070 recommended for 4K high 60 frames per second, except at DLSS performance. So, yeah, that's native. That's a 1080p render that's then being upscaled, so it doesn't really actually tell us that much about the demands here. Now, the CPUs have continued to jump up on the AMD side of things from a 1600 to a 2600, and then to a 3600. And then the Intel one finally jumps up from the 4770 to the i5 8400. So we could take a quick look at those. So the 8400 is a 6-core, 6-thread CPU. This is from a newer generation, though, 2017. So each core will be a lot more powerful than what we were seeing on the 4770. And they're also jumping up the AMD recommendation to the Ryzen 5 3600, 6-core, 12-thread. Now, again, the resolution should not really be increasing the demand on the CPU, although certain graphics settings can. But anyway, let's jump back in here. I don't want to make this video incredibly long or anything. Let's take a quick look at the ray tracing on settings. So if we want to go RT on, it looks like you can go 1080p 60 frames per second medium on the RTX 3060, which is, wait, that's what we were already doing. So what's the difference? Well, now they're kicking on DLSS quality. Also, they changed the CPU to an Intel i3 6100. Now, turning on ray tracing can increase CPU load, but this is weird. They're also back to the Ryzen 5 2600 on AMD. So the Intel Core i3 6100 is a dual-core, 4-thread CPU from 2015, and I just don't think this makes sense. Maybe it's just what they happened to test on, and it worked, but then I don't see how that makes anything else on the rest of their chart make sense. Because if I need a... Look, you know what? I don't know if I need to dwell on this other than... if you need a i5 8400 to hit 60 frames per second here, usually kicking on ray tracing increases the CPU demand. So I don't know why we're dropping back to an i3 from a previous generation to hit 60 frames per second with ray tracing enabled. But anyway, they keep that 6100 recommendation up through here until they hit 4K. Where they jump back up to that 8400. So again, I think something is weird happening on the CPUs. Whatever. Now for RT high settings at 1440p 60 frames per second, but using DLSS quality, they're jumping up to the RTX 4070. So if we want to get an idea of how that compares relatively to other GPUs, again, we could go from the 3060 was the baseline for ray tracing, right, at 1080p medium. So we're now jumping up to 1440p high settings and 60 frames per second. We got to scroll quite a ways So the 4070 is almost twice as powerful, not quite, but almost twice as powerful. And in a ray tracing situation with updates to the ray tracing hardware and all of that, could actually be closer to actually double the performance. Again, it's a 12 gigabyte GPU. Tested it out on my channel quite a bit. And yeah, but again, that's with DLSS quality. So they're not even saying that you would get a native 60 frames per second on the 4070 at 1440p high, and for RT Ultra, 4K 60 frames per second at epic settings. So we're finally seeing epic settings, which means that none of these were actually listing the game at its maximum settings, but now we're going up to epic settings. They're recommending an RTX 4080. Now check this out. For 60 frames per second at 4K resolution, with epic ray tracing enabled, they're recommending not only an RTX 4080, but an RTX 4080 at DLSS performance, which remember is rendering the game at 1080p and then upscaling it. So that looks extremely demanding. So my overall thoughts on the system requirements chart here is, first of all, I think there's some typos and some of this doesn't look particularly well thought out. I also hate the fact that they're recommending GPUs based on how they perform using upscaling, not how they're performing natively, other than the 1080p low and medium settings here. And I'm really curious how demanding this ray tracing situation will be if the RTX 4080 needs DLSS performance mode to hit 60 frames per second maxed out, at 4K. So that is a lot. And they do say that they are recommending DLSS 3 to hit high refresh rate numbers. Now, there's a couple ways you could read that. This could just be an advertisement that DLSS 3 is in the game. It could also be an advertisement that the game might be CPU limited, because frame generation is one of the ways that you avoid a CPU limitation. I believe this game is using Unreal Engine 4. And especially with ray tracing enabled, we've seen a lot of CPU limitations and stuttering in Unreal Engine 4 games. Now, I was hoping that because this game is supporting the older consoles, it does list PS4, Xbox One, and even Nintendo Switch on the list here. It does say Unreal Engine, and I don't have any reason to believe it's Unreal Engine 5, so I would assume Unreal Engine 4. I would have hoped to have lower system requirements and better performance, especially, like I said, given the graphics that we're seeing here. I'm not saying the game, graphics aren't necessarily the most important thing in a game, but when you look at the performance, the system requirements that they're saying that we'll need for this, and again, this is the RTX ON trailer that's going to be trying to show it in its best possible light. I'm just not blown away. So I'm hoping this isn't the latest completely unoptimized Unreal Engine 4 PC game. And, maybe Nvidia's just trying to sell you some hardware with this chart. This game's going to need some testing when it comes out. What do you guys think? Let me know in the comment section. I hope all of you have an excellent day.